G'day and welcome to Full Bore. I'm Steve Lanchester, and on this episode I'm going to show you why this engine is probably one of the best engines ever made. This engine doesn't need any introduction, especially if you watch Initial D, but it is a 4AGE, of course. That essentially means that it is the fourth incarnation of the A series motor, whereas the G stands for a performance-orientated valve layout and the E stands for electronic fuel injection. I also have on the ground its older brother. That's called a 3AC motor, and we'll show you a few differences in a second. So this is what you call a red top 4AGE, which sort of predominantly came out in the 1990s. 4AGEs first came out in Australia in about 1985. To put that into perspective, most Australian families were driving around in XE Falcons and VK Commodore. And they had inline 6-cylinder engines which had 2 valves per cylinder, were generally running some rubbishy like Carter carby from America that flooded the thing every morning. And the block was probably designed in 1960. So not a lot of terrific stuff there. Well, I mean, they're good cars, but that, that's a story for another day. Anyway, so if you had a 4AGE back in the 1980s, you would have been hot property. And the reason being is, well, there's a few factors. The major one being a thing called EFI. Now, some of you Americans may never have heard of this thing called EFI, but it stands for electronic fuel injection. Now, essentially what that means is that there's a little box inside your dash, and it tells the engine how much fuel to dump in. That's pretty good because it's good for emissions, it's good for power, it's good for starting up in the morning, it's good for your back pocket, essentially. Another good thing about the 4AGE, which was probably it was unheard of back in the 1980s, was a thing called double overhead cams. Now, it's not the first engine ever to have double overhead cams, not by a long shot. But back in the 1980s, when you were driving around in 202s or 250 crossflows and all that sort of stuff, this was hot property. And the only other cars back in the day to have this sort of engine were like Alfa Romeos and Jaguars and all that sort of stuff. The sort of thing where if you bought it, you'd probably have a puddle in your driveway of oil like the next day. Hey, this thing says Toyota on top, so you're going to have no issues. Now, the reason I got a 3AC engine is to give you further perspective as to how much of a spaceship this bad boy is. So, these engines don't necessarily share parts, but they're based off the same block or the same series. So this one being a 3A, this one is a 4A. That one's a 1.6 litre, this one's a 1.5. Now you could get 4As, which were essentially that, but like a carbureted version, and essentially this, but slightly bigger. So, what we've got on the side here is a tangled mess of vacuum lines and diaphragms and all that sort of stuff. This is essentially how the engine controls how much fuel goes into the motor. Hey, this engine is by all means a really good motor, especially once again by comparison to what you would have had back in the times. And hey, some people, the poor souls, had what they call Starfire engines, which were like old Holden engines cut down to 2 cylinders, etc. So this compared to a Starfire engine is like light years apart. There's still an overhead cam design, etc, etc. But in the 4AGE, what they essentially done was got rid of all this and replaced it with one of these. This is called a fuel injector. And that's where all the magic happens and it shoots your fuel inside of your engine so you get a really good bang. Now that is controlled by this special magic box which is called an ECU. This one is, you know, pretty antiquated, and it's probably got like hamsters running around on wheels and stuff in there, and like, I don't know, vacuum tubes. Not really, but it's pretty old by today's standards. But this is predominantly what pretty much every car in 1984 had. And then all of a sudden you got this spaceship, which is, of course, the 4AGE. And it was a glorious time to be alive. Except for maybe the 1960s and 70s, which were probably even better for other reasons. But it's a good motor. So now that you know why the 4AG engine is in fact so good, I'll give you a bit of a rundown as to the different variants of said motor. The first being the one that originally came out in about 1983, which is called the Blue Top, which is, of course, you can tell by the blue writing on the tablet covers. It's a special little beast. The reason being is it's got huge intake ports for the size of the engine, only being a 1.6 litre. And what that essentially meant is that at low RPM you didn't get much air velocity into the engine. So they added a thing called variable intake runners. So instead of having 4 intake runners in your inlet manifold, you actually had 8. That's cool for one reason. It meant that they could switch from a long intake runner, which is really good for torque, to a short intake runner, which is good for high-end power. And that would kick in at about 4,500 RPM, which was sort of like, you can think of it like pre-VTEC. It gave you like a boost at specifically 4,500 RPM. It's got nothing to do with your valve timing. It's all got to do with the way that the air flies into your engine. Pretty cool. So the next engine to come along in the 4A series is what they call the black/red top, or black-red top. And you can figure them out because they've got twin cam written in black and then 16 valve written in red. They've also got like an open space between in the valley of the twin cam, or whatever you want to call it. They don't have this special cover. Now, they were the first of the 7-ribbed blocks, and I think they got rid of the variable inlet runners. I'm not 100% sure on that one. So this particular engine is a red top 4AGE. As you can see, it's got red lettering on the top. It's also called a small port 4AGE because it's got smaller port runners, and they actually deleted the dual intake runner per cylinder setup, which means that it's a tidier inlet manifold and probably a little bit easier in regards to all your vacuum lines and all that sort of stuff. So this particular engine is probably one of the more sought after ones, primarily because it's simpler than the previous one in regards to the intake. It's got the stronger block with the 7 ribs, yeah, and it's got beefier internals. So the red top's got beefier internals than the blue top. It's also got oil squirters that spray at the bottom of the piston to keep everything cooler and better lubricated. And this one is probably the one that you'd go for if you were to turbo it, with a couple of exceptions. Another thing that this particular engine has is a knock sensor in the side of the block, and that's a pretty cool piece of kit. What that essentially is a microphone in the side of the block that picks up pre-detonation. That's caused by rubbishy fuels igniting before top dead center. So if your engine's pre-detonating, that little thing will pick it up, send a signal to your computer, and then your computer will actually automatically retard your ignition timing. That's pretty cool because you can say go for 98 octane fuel in one tank and then dump 91 into it in the second tank, and it will automatically adjust everything out. Now the next incarnation of this particular motor is what they call a silver top, and it's pretty special because it's a 5 valve per cylinder engine, which is like, once again, revolutionary for a production engine. It's got a bit more gubbins going on, and I think some of them also got variable valve timing, or VVTI, or if you're sort of a Honda bloke, you could also call it VTEC, but it's Toyota's variant of it. It was an excellent motor, and it's probably one that you'd turbo if you had one as well, because they are quite a strong little unit. The one after that is what they call a black top. It's essentially a silver top in that it's got 5 valves per cylinder, but it's got lighter internals, so they will rev to the moon and back, but you probably wouldn't turbo one because they're a little bit lighter inside. There's a couple of sub-variants, such as the 4AGZE in a red top, which is essentially this motor but beefed up again. So you could put, well, they actually put from factory a supercharger on the side. You primarily found them in like Levin Corollas, and in some cases the Toyota MR2. So they're a pretty good little unit, and that would be the specific motor that you would probably turbo if you were looking to turbo a 4AGE, because it's probably the strongest one out of the whole shebang. Regardless, you could probably turbo all of them, and with a moderate boost get some really good gains, because they are just an old school cast iron block with aluminium head, similar to a 2JZ, but not a 2JZ, and minus 2 cylinders, and it's not a 2JZ. But it's a 4AGE, and it's good nonetheless. Now you may be wondering, why is Steve talking about 4AGEs, and why does he have one in front of him? Well, I'm an old school bloke with old school needs, and I don't mind me a carburetor or two. But there's nothing like the sound of a 4AGE blasting its way up the toge in Japan in a AE86 or something like that. So I've got this 4AGE out of an AE92, which you already know, and it's probably most likely going to make its way into something cool in the foreseeable future. Now you will have to look out for that particular episode. It might happen, it might not, but I'd very much like it to. So if you've got a T50 gearbox kicking around in your backyard and you want to give it to me for a really good price, don't hesitate, because I'm looking for a T50 gearbox to put it into something really cool. Anyway, we'll catch you next time, and hopefully you've been better informed onto the glorious institution that is in fact the 4AGE family. We hope you've had a good episode here. We'll catch you next time on Full Bore.